welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're going to be zeroing in on a topic that's pretty crucial, I think, for any military leader.
Yeah.
It's Clausewitz's concept of the general action.
Okay.
We're diving deep into Chapter 9 of Book 4 of On War
Okay.
to uncover what this Prussian general can teach us about achieving decisive victory.
And while Clausewitz was writing back in the 19th century, his ideas on decisive action are far from outdated.
Yeah.
Military strategists still study and debate his work today, and for good reason, as I think you'll see.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So he starts by defining this idea of a general action. It's not just any random firefight, is it?
Not at all. Clausewitz is talking about a clash of main forces where both sides are fully committed to achieving a true victory that can decide the entire conflict. Think of it as distinct from smaller engagements that might have limited tactical objectives.
He uses the phrase, fought principally on its own account, which sounds pretty intriguing. What's he getting at there?
It's like he's saying that a general action takes on a life of its own. It's not just a means to an end, but a pivotal event that can dramatically shape the entire course of a war.
Okay, so how does this 19th century concept of general action hold up in the modern era? Warfare has changed drastically since Clausewitz's time, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And Clausewitz himself recognized that warfare was evolving even back then.
Yeah.
He saw how battles were moving away from those rigid formations and evolving into more fluid engagements focused on wearing down the enemy's forces over time.
I remember that vivid imagery he uses talking about the cinders of battered battalions.
Exactly. It's a grim picture, but it underscores this concept of attrition.
Right.
Of gradually eroding the enemy's strength. And if you think about it, that idea is more relevant than ever in modern warfare.
That's fascinating. So even with all the advancements in technology, the ability to outlast an adversary, to maintain resilience, and the capacity to reinforce these remain crucial elements of modern warfare.
Precisely. It's no longer just about lining up troops on a field. It's about logistics, technology, intelligence, and even things like public opinion. The side that can sustain its fighting capacity over the long haul often gains a decisive advantage.
So how does a commander caught in the heat of battle, when things are turning against them, it's easy to talk about it calmly here,
Sure.
but on a chaotic battlefield?
It's the ultimate test of leadership, isn't it? Clausewitz highlights 3 key indicators a commander should watch for, and you'll find they still resonate today.
Okay.
First, he talks about fruitless efforts.
Okay, so if your attacks consistently fail to achieve their objectives, if you're being pushed back, that's a sign that things might not be going your way.
Exactly. The second indicator he mentions is seeing the lines of fire wavering. Now, this could refer to literal lines of musket fire, but I think we can interpret it more broadly.
So it's not just about literal firepower, but a more general sense of waning momentum, a loss of coordination and effectiveness in your attacks. What would that look like in a modern context?
Great question. It could be anything from the failure to penetrate enemy air defenses to unsuccessful cyber attacks that are constantly being countered. Think about a scenario where your supply lines are disrupted by drones or special forces. And you're right, it's about recognizing those signs of faltering coordination, dwindling resources, and a loss of initiative. Now, Clausewitz's third indicator is a bit more stark, wounded crowds.
Meaning the rate at which your forces are being depleted, right? High casualty rates is a sign that the battle is turning against you.
Exactly. Now, in a modern context, wounded crowds could also refer to the loss of key equipment, critical infrastructure, or even the erosion of public support due to a successful disinformation campaign.
That's a really interesting point. It's not just about physical casualties anymore, but about the depletion of resources and morale across multiple domains.
Precisely. And that brings us to another critical aspect of Clausewitz's thinking on decisive action, the role of reserves.
Right. He places a lot of emphasis on having fresh troops available at crucial moments. But how does that translate to modern warfare, where things like technology, logistics, and cyber warfare often play such decisive roles?
That's where Clausewitz's insights really shine, because while he talks about fresh troops, the underlying principle is much broader. Today, those fresh reserves could be anything from a squadron of fighter jets held in reserve to a team of hackers ready to launch a counter-cyber attack.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's about having those untapped resources, those game changers you can deploy at a moment's notice to seize the initiative.
So it's about adaptability and responsiveness, that ability to adapt to the changing circumstances of the battlefield, whatever form that battlefield might take.
Exactly. Now, Clausewitz argues that a commander's decision to retreat often hinges on the availability of reserves. But he also highlights two other critical factors that can force a commander's hand: the increasing danger of retreat and the impending arrival of night.
So let's unpack those, starting with the danger of retreat. What does Clausewitz mean by that?
It's a simple but often overlooked point as a battle progresses. And especially if it's going against you, retreating becomes increasingly risky.
Okay.
Your forces are likely disorganized, their morale might be shaken, and they're vulnerable to counterattack. The longer you wait, the more hazardous it becomes to disengage.
So there's this constant tension between holding on in the hope of turning the tide and recognizing when it's time to cut your losses and live to fight another day. It reminds me of that saying, discretion is the better part of valor.
Precisely. And Clausewitz uses the example of Napoleon at Waterloo to illustrate this very point. Napoleon, despite being a brilliant military mind, kept throwing troops into the fight, even when it became clear that the battle was lost. His relentless pursuit of victory in that moment ultimately led to the destruction of his army.
It's a sobering reminder that courage and tenacity, while essential, must be tempered with a healthy dose of pragmatism. And that brings us to the second factor. Clausewitz mentions nightfall.
Right throughout history, night has served as a natural ceasefire, a time to regroup, reassess, and recover. Clausewitz recognized that night provides cover for a retreat, a chance to withdraw under the cloak of darkness and regroup.
So in a way, recognizing the need for retreat, making that difficult decision to disengage, can be the more strategic form of courage.
Absolutely, and it requires a particular type of courage, one grounded in reason and a clear-headed assessment of the situation.
Because leads to that internal struggle. Clausewitz describes the conflict between a commander's courage and their reason.
Exactly. On one hand, you have this drive to win, to never give up, to fight for every inch of ground. But on the other hand, you have the cold, hard logic of the situation, the need to make rational decisions based on the facts on the ground, even when those facts paint a grim picture. It's a dilemma every military leader has faced throughout history.
And as Clausewitz so powerfully puts it, however highly we must esteem courage and firmness in war, there is a point beyond which perseverance can only be termed a desperate folly. But in the heat of the moment, how does a commander find that balance, that sweet spot between courage and reason, especially with so much at stake?
It's one of the toughest calls, isn't it?
Yeah.
Clausewitz doesn't offer a simple formula because warfare is too complex for that, but he does offer a framework for analyzing the situation under pressure.
So it's about cultivating that clarity of thought even when the fog of war is thickest.
Exactly. That's why he stresses experience studying military history, really internalizing those principles of war, because it's that knowledge, that ability to see the bigger picture that can help a commander make those split-second life or death decisions.
You know, it strikes me that, in a way, that's what we're trying to do here with this deep dive.
Yeah.
By digging into Clausewitz's work, by applying his ideas to modern scenarios, it's like we're giving our listeners a glimpse into that strategic mindset, that ability to see the battlefield from a commander's perspective.
Yeah, I think you're right on the money there. And it's not just about understanding what Clausewitz said, but about internalizing those principles, making them your own.
Yeah.
So that when you're faced with a challenge, whether it's on a battlefield or in any high-stakes situation, you have that framework for making those tough calls.
It's about developing that strategic muscle, that ability to anticipate, adapt, and stay one step ahead.
Absolutely. And that's why Clausewitz is so relevant, not just for military leaders, but for anyone operating in a complex, dynamic environment.
Yeah.
Leading a team, negotiating a deal, even just navigating the challenges of everyday life. Those principles of clear-headed analysis and decisive action, they really can make all the difference.
So as we start to wrap up our deep dive into Clausewitz's concept of general action, what are some key takeaways for our listeners to carry with them?
I think the biggest takeaway is that while the tools of warfare may change the fundamental nature of war, that clash of wills, that struggle for dominance, remains remarkably constant.
Yeah.
Understanding those timeless principles, those enduring truths about conflict, is absolutely essential for navigating our increasingly complex world.
And one of those enduring truths is that there's always more to learn, isn't there?
Always. And that's part of what makes it so fascinating. Clausewitz isn't giving us all the answers, but he's shining a light on the path, helping us ask the right questions about leadership strategy and the nature of conflict itself.
He gives us the tools to think critically about these timeless challenges, which, as you said, often mirror the challenges we face in other areas of life.
Precisely. Which brings us back to that final thought you raised earlier. If the nature of general action is always evolving, as Clausewitz suggests, what might be the defining characteristics of a decisive battle in the 21st century and beyond? What new factors could tip the scales of victory or defeat?
It's a question that's been on my mind throughout this entire deep dive. It seems like the battlefields of the future will be less about controlling physical territory and more about controlling information narratives, even perceptions.
Absolutely. We're already seeing that play out with the rise of cyber warfare disinformation campaigns and the battle for hearts and minds in the digital sphere. The front lines are becoming increasingly blurred, wouldn't you say?
It's almost as if the front lines are everywhere and nowhere at the same time, and the weapons aren't just bullets and bombs, but data algorithms and the narratives we choose to believe.
And in that kind of battle space, perhaps the decisive general action isn't a single epic clash, but a series of interconnected engagements across multiple domains, cyber informational economic, and yes, even kinetic.
It's like that quote from Sun Tzu. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting.
Exactly. And that requires a whole new level of strategic thinking, a recognition that victory in the 21st century might not look like the victories of the past.
It's a lot to process, but that's the beauty of a deep dive. Like, isn't it?
Yeah.
It leaves you with more questions than answers. But those questions spark new insights, new connections, and ultimately a deeper understanding of our complex world.
I couldn't agree more.
So to our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Clausewitz's general action. Keep those questions coming. Keep exploring these ideas, and most importantly, keep thinking strategically.